All right, we've all heard this before, that you need carbohydrates to perform in sports, particularly at a high level. We hear this from various influencers, even many sports scientists will promote this, and this is based on what they say is decades of science. However, new research is coming to light, which seems to show a little bit more nuance around this, and that carbohydrates may not yield the best performance and may not be necessary in certain situations. So let's talk about that in this video. We primarily have three places in the body where we store significant amounts of carbohydrate or glucose. The storage form of glucose is glycogen in our muscles, which is a large portion, about 400 to 500 grams, our liver, which is slightly smaller at about 122 grams, and then a very tiny amount that is circulating in our blood in the form of blood glucose. Now, exercise can deplete all of these as just, basically functioning, deplete some of that. And so what has been traditionally thought of as the main fuel for our muscles is the muscle glycogen. As it breaks down, it's an immediate source of glucose, immediate source of fuel, and aids in performance. And while that certainly is true, new research is showing that what ultimately may be regulating performance is not so much the glycogen stores directly, but more importantly, the blood glucose, and certainly the blood glucose as it is sensed by the brain. Now let me get into a little more detail on that. Okay, normally our blood glucose is held in a steady state, usually between about 70 and 100 milligrams per deciliter at rest. And that is held in position by a number of hormones: insulin, glucagon, cortisone, norepinephrine. These things all work very hard to maintain it within that range. And if it starts to drift out of that range and gets too high, insulin is secreted. If it is getting too low, then those other hormones will be secreted to maintain that. Primarily, it's acting on the liver. The liver has a direct impact on blood glucose, whereas the muscles have very minimal impact on blood glucose. Remember, the glucose in the muscles are metabolized by the muscle cells themselves and don't really participate to the blood glucose pool outside of producing lactate, which is then turned into glucose again via gluconeogenesis by the liver. So it has an indirect effect on there. But as blood glucose falls as we exercise, our brain senses that, and it tends to shut down performance to protect ourselves. Okay, one sort of concern that I hear being bandied about is the fact that if you're in a low carb state, you won't have to rely on the catabolism of muscle, that is burning muscle and the amino acids to produce glucose to support gluconeogenesis. Well, what we know is that in a chronically adaptive state, that basically is not occurring to any significant degree. Most of the gluconeogenesis is occurring from recycled glucose through things like lactate reshuttling via the Cori cycle. There are other pathways, glycerol production. You can also convert some of the acetone and ketones into glucose as well. So it is not the issue for a chronically adapted person that some would make it seem like. Okay, so pick your strategy, whatever you like. If you need to be on a low carb diet for health reasons, you certainly can perform well. You certainly can perform well at some of the highest levels in most activities. It's just up to you. Most people prefer carbohydrates because they're cheap, they're accessible. A lot of people like the way they taste, but some people just don't use them for whatever reason. All right, so where does this new science come in? So recently, a paper produced by Professor Tim Noakes, Phil Prinz, and several other researchers looked specifically at athletes, specifically triathletes, doing time to exhaustion. And they looked at them, comparing them in a chronically low carb adapted state versus folks in a higher carb state. And this was a randomized controlled trial. It was a crossover trial. So people participated in both arms of the study to see how their performance was impacted. And what they found was primarily that blood glucose and not muscle glycogen was the primary regulator of performance. That is to say, as long as blood glucose was held in a normal physiologic state, there was no decline in performance. That is to say, the folks on low carb did just as well as the people on high carb, provided that the blood glucose stayed within the same range. Now, let's think about what that means for the average person, because this is what we all care about, right? So if performance is your goal and you're also performing in a low carb state, you want to maintain, decent blood glucose. Now, some things that happen is as you chronically get adapted to low carb states, let's say you've been doing a low carb diet as an athlete for a minimum of 4 weeks and more likely 2 to 3 months from what I've been able to ascertain, is that you will not use glycogen in your muscle or liver as much as someone who is chronically in a high carb diet. That's why when people who are chronically used to high carb diets drop carbs, they note that their performance falls off, at least initially. But once you become fully chronically adapted to utilizing fat, the liver glycogen is not depleted as readily, therefore the blood glucose doesn't drop as readily. The muscle glycogen is not depleted as readily, therefore you still maintain that intramuscular source of fuel for direct muscle contraction at the highest of intensities. If your exercise lasts for hours and hours, over 2 hours at high intensity, you're going to see falling of blood glucose, and that is where the caveats come in. If you are a marathon runner, a long distance cyclist, then carbohydrates can be beneficial in that situation. And only a small amount is needed. You don't need these massive amounts that many people have prescribed. You just need enough to keep that blood glucose at a normal state, right? If you're doing athletics, and including most sports, like, the vast majority of the people in the world outside of a few endurance athletes, you will be fine. As long as your blood glucose is maintained in a normal state, you'll have excellent performance. This is what I've seen personally. I've seen as long as my blood glucose, and I wear a CGM from time to time, is within a certain range, I can compete at the highest levels. I can set world records, and I have. So this sort of puts a wrinkle into the belief that it's all about muscle glycogen, and we must keep that chronically as full as possible in order to perform at the highest levels, because the newest science doesn't seem to support that. As a master's level athlete, I have much less pain. I have much less inflammation, soreness around my joints, which for me also translates into better performance. So remember, it is the brain and blood glucose that seem to be the ultimate arbiter of overall performance, and not muscle glycogen levels, as we've been taught to believe over the many, many decades. Despite some of the evidence that shows muscle glycogen being important, it is not the ultimate regulator. And then in a low carb state, your muscle glycogen is generally preserved because you're better at utilizing fat. All right, let me know what you guys think. Let me know what your experience has been, how you've been able to perform in a lower carb state. Has it been a net negative? Has it been positive? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you'd like to support what we're doing at Rivero, please check us out. If you have patients, friends, family, loved ones you think could benefit from, just very high level support to help them to reverse their disease at the root cause level and not just medicate them more, check out Rivero.com. We are also, raising funds to scale what we're doing. We've already successfully launched a company. We're already seeing hundreds and hundreds of patients and changing their lives. So please help us make a difference, fight back from this craziness that's out there. All right, guys, take care.